invite you to be seated. Turn in your Bibles to Ecclesiastes chapter 3. We're going to be looking at verses 1 through 15 this morning. Ecclesiastes chapter 3. And so if you're new here, what we're doing this year is we're spending an entire year in the Old Testament. And we've begun going through this book of Ecclesiastes. And the first two chapters of this book have really been focused on helping us come to the realization that a life lived on a horizontal plane alone, that is, in relation to creation and not the creator as paramount, is what the writer calls haval. It's vanity, meaningless. The teacher showed us the futility of hoping in this life by showing us that nature is stuck in a monotonous prison. And then he goes on to show from his experience that fulfillment is not found, purpose is not found, meaning is not found by looking to wisdom or knowledge, pleasure, work, or possessions. And at the end of chapter 2, he arrived at this conclusion, which was, in light of the impact of sin on our world and part of living in the ashes of Eden, rather than looking to the things of this world to give us meaning and purpose and fulfillment, we should look to God, the one who gives us good things. And in doing so, we should enjoy them as a means of enjoying Him. So in other words, the perspective is God is ultimate. Everything on this earth is not, yet even in the brokenness of this world, even in the ashes of Eden, God still gives really good gifts. And so we should enjoy those gifts. We should receive them as good gifts and use those as an avenue to enjoy God. Enjoy Him as ultimate. Enjoy Him as where we find our identity and our purpose and our meaning and our fulfillment, not in the gifts that He gives. And that leads us to our text today. Today we're looking at perhaps one of the most familiar texts in this book. And if you are of a particular vintage, you might know it by the song Turn, 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 which is by the Byrds, not by Simon and Garfunkel. I got corrected on that last week. And so even as you read this text, you might hear in your mind as you start to read it, like that chord just keeps on, and then you might be tempted to add turn, 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 right? To everything, turn, turn, turn. And it goes on and on and on. That song is taken exactly from this text. And my parents gave me a good musical education. And so I grew up with this song. And I had it ringing in my head as I was reading. I'm sick of that song at this point. But while the words of that song are taken from this poem right here, the song by the Byrds misses the point and offers no exposition on what the meaning of that poem is. This text not only gives us the poem that the Byrds turned into a hit pop song in 1965, but it also gives us an exposition and explanation of what we should do with that. Right? It doesn't just leave us hanging. And what's auspiciously absent from the song that the Byrds sang is that they didn't account for the fact that seasons never last. The song ends with a time for peace. I swear it's not too late. The song was aimed at this hope that there would come out of a season of war and come to a season of peace that would last, and they missed the point, which is it doesn't last. Nothing lasts. We live lives in seasons, and seasons change. And so what the author of Ecclesiastes offers is not the pessimistic hope that the Byrds offer. The author of Ecclesiastes is celebrating the orderliness of God as a means of pointing us to God as our hope. And so as we look at this today, we're going to see that we can embrace and endure seasons in our lives through hoping in God. So the first thing we see is that there are times and seasons in the ashes of Eden. And we see that in the first 8 verses of this text. Let me just read them for you. For everything there is a season and a time for every matter under heaven, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck up what is planted, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to break down and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones together, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to seek and a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to cast away, a time to tear and a time to sow, a time to keep in silence and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. So in this poem, what we see is that life is composed of joys and sorrows, building and destroying, living and dying. Each one of them comes in its proper time. And this reminds us that we are creatures of time and not yet able to partake in the joys of eternity. One commentator said, "No one can be happy who has not come to grips with the reality that life is full of changes and sorrows as well as continuity and joy. We must accept that we are mortal and governed by time." And the point is that seasons come and seasons go. There are times when certain things are appropriate. And we need to recognize when that time is, but we also need to recognize when that time has passed. Some people miss out on joyful seasons because they're still living in the sorrowful seasons of the past. Some people struggle to discern when the right season is to speak and when the right season is to be silent. Maybe that's kind of me, but we all struggle with different things in this. We recognize that there are seasons, and we don't necessarily do a great job of living in those seasons, but we know from experience that we live lives that are governed by different seasons in life. The point is that everything changes and nothing stays the same. So there are seasons in family and individual lives, in countries, in churches and businesses. And many of us struggle with this because we're trying to hold on to something from our past and haven't learned. And in that, we miss the work that God is doing in the season that God has us in. Right? That what the author is doing here is he's showing that all of life is encompassed by these different seasons. And what we tend to do is we tend to get stuck in the season that we want to be in, or the season that we wish we were in, or in the season we used to be in, and we miss out on what God is doing in the season that he actually has us in right now. One of the sources of much sorrow and frustration in life is not embracing changing seasons. So we are not in heaven. We cannot hold on to what is fading. You will have seasons of joy and seasons of sorrow in your family, in your marriage, in your life. You cannot grasp them, right? Lewis talks about having the thrill, and you hold on to the thrill. You try to hold on to the thrill, but you can't hold on to the thrill. You need to let the thrill go and move on and anticipate new, greater thrills in the future. But the moment you try to hold on to the thrill, it disappears. Think about the moment that you try to laugh, you can't. Right? You hear a funny joke and you laugh, and that's a different laugh than when you hear a not funny joke and try to laugh to make the person feel better. It's different. You cannot force that, right? Worship. You've maybe experienced this. There are moments when you will find yourself spontaneously worshiping. And it's almost like the moment you become aware of that and try to govern it and hold on to it, it disappears. We live in these seasons. And we, as finite beings, cannot hold on to them, cannot control them, cannot manipulate them. Seasons come and seasons go. The only things that never change are death and taxes. Those two things stay the same in this life, but everything else shifts and moves. You cannot alter the natural status of things. And try as you may, You cannot overcome the limitations of being a created being that is living in a created world. In a created world that has been damaged by sin. So there are times and seasons that God has appointed for you and I. There are times and seasons that God has appointed for your family. There are times and seasons that God has appointed for nations. We cannot make seeds grow in winter. No matter how hard we try, we cannot make them grow if we go outside and just start planting in, summer crops in the middle of December when the ground is cold and hard. It won't work. We cannot change these things. We cannot change what has been ordained. We cannot determine, for example, when you're born or when you die. We find ourselves vacillating between joy and sorrow, seemingly moment by moment, as external pressures and events press on us that we are powerless to affect. This poem shows the poles of the whole human experience in the ashes of Eden. Death, birth, joy, sorrow, peace, war. There's a spectrum, and within that spectrum, we tend to live, and it shifts and changes. And so, he isn't trying to evaluate them as good or bad, or wise or foolish, or righteous or sinful. He's simply making the point that there are appointed times and seasons, and that we live in and are powerless to change. And because of that, we can all experientially identify with this. You know that our lives run the gamut of emotional experience. You know that nothing stays the same. That just as seasons of nature change, so also seasons in our lives change. And we cannot stop it. And the more we try to stop it, the more we try to control it, the more we try to govern it, the more frustrated and disillusioned we become. There are seasons of singleness and seasons of marriage and then seasons of widowhood. There are seasons of sorrow, seasons of joy. There's seasons of families expanding and seasons of families dwindling. I just want you to think for a moment of where you're at right now. What season are you in? And how much of your effort and energy is tied up in trying to manage and control and govern and structure and steer what you are powerless to steer? How much of your energy is spent trying to change what you cannot change, trying to manipulate things in your life to get the desired outcome? And how different would your life be if you somehow learned to be content in the season that God has you in? That's what the poem is calling us to consider. There are seasons of health and sickness. There's seasons of love and hate. There's times to gather and times to scatter. The teacher goes through 14 pairs of opposites to show us the full range or the measure to which we are subjected to things outside of our control. And they illustrate in a very powerful way the extent to which sin has impacted creation. For example, there's a time to be born and a time to die. The bookends of life. And here, we have to understand that in the created order that we see in Genesis chapter 1 and 2, death is not natural. Death is something that came because of sin. And so death in this text is a reminder of the impact that sin has had on creation. And what's more is just as you are powerless to control when you are born, you are powerless to control when you die. God has appointed the days of each person's life, and you cannot change that. Death reminds us that something is not right with our world. There's a time for peace and a time for war. War is a result of the impact of sin on creation. We're not created for war, but we're created for peace. And yet war reminds us that sin has damaged creation. You can go through the whole list and see that this is true of almost all of them. And we can see that we are powerless to change them, powerless to overcome them. We might do all that we can to pursue peace, and yet war still comes. You can buy into the safety cult and try to cheat death. You can eat super healthy. You can avoid everything. You not hold a cell phone up to your head because you might get cancer, and still you will die. And you will die at the appointed time that God has set for you. You can be minding your own business and someone attack you and you must kill in self-defense. There are times to embrace and not embrace. In other words, there are times when you should greet a friend with a hug and times when you should sever a relationship. There are times to tear down and times to build up. There are times to remove buildings and there's times to build new buildings. There's a time to seek and a time to lose. When you lose something, there's a season that you should be looking for it. And then when you don't find it, there's a season when you should stop looking. There's a time to rejoice and a time to mourn. Think of weddings and funerals. And all of this is not random. It highlights God's sovereignty over all of life. The sovereign God rules and reigns over what happens in time. Look at chapter 3, verse 1. For everything there is a season and a time for every matter under heaven. In verse 11, it says that he has made everything beautiful in its time. He has put eternity into man's heart. Verse 12, it says, verse 14 says, I perceive that whatever God does endures forever. Nothing can be added to it, nor can anything be taken from it. The scope shows us these polar pairs, and God rules and reigns over all of our moments and all of our days. God's will and decrees are greater than sin. He determines the seasons and overcomes the damage of sin, and we'll see that in just a minute. But for right now, it's worth noting, we're not all really that different, are we? We all experience these different seasons. We all know from experience how quickly these seasons can change. We know how one moment you can be in laughter and everything can seem fine and nothing could possibly go wrong, and then a phone rings. We all know that your life can be going on this trajectory and all of a sudden it goes on this trajectory. We all know what it is to start something with anticipation, thinking that this is the way it's going to be, only to find out that it goes a totally different way. All of us have experienced the same spectrum of human experiences in the ashes of Eden, and we are all powerless to change it. So what should we learn from this? The first thing that we should learn is there is an inherent unreliability and transience, in this world. Nothing lasts. Things change. You cannot rely on your laughter to remain in 10 minutes. You cannot count on your best friend or spouse to be alive tomorrow. You cannot count on a good crop. And therefore, when we recognize that and see that and embrace that, that causes us to fix our hope on what is reliable, what is sustainable, what is stable, what is not transient. Some people are absolutely crushed when laughter turns to sorrow because they counted on that laughter to last forever. Their hope was placed in the wrong place. So Paul says things like, you can be sorrowful yet always rejoicing. How do you do that? It's like a big question. We all want that, but how do you do that? Well, the answer is don't hope in the joy. Hope in God. This is calling us when we see that there's an inherent unreliability and transience to this world, that nothing lasts. We naturally are looking for something or someone that does last, something or someone that is stable. And that's where we should put our hope. The second thing we see is that there is an inevitability of change. This poem shows us that nothing stays the same. Seasons change, and they change based on time, right? There is a season and a time for every matter under heaven. God has appointed them, and therefore, when things change and when things shift, we should see that as a regular, natural thing to be embraced, not something to push back against, because God is over those things. Nothing stays the same. Seasons change. Circumstances change. Change is part of living in the ashes of Eden. You cannot hold on to what is changing, and you cannot stop the change. Therefore, we should learn to accept and embrace change as we do when we move from summer to fall and fall to winter. I don't like winter. I'm not a fan of the cold. And I don't like summer. I'm not a fan of the hot. I love fall and spring. Hoodie weather is my jam. I love going out in a hoodie and shorts when it's just a little bit crisp in the air and you got that wind that's blowing in your face, and that's beautiful. But no matter how much I try, and no matter how much I don't like winter and summer, they come. And so it's up to me then to live my life in a way that deals with that change rather than trying to stop it, right? So therefore, put on a coat, pop up the heat, turn on the air conditioning, run the water in the backyard and go run through it, whatever, right? We cannot change the seasons. Change is inevitable. And so we must learn how to live in a constant state of change and seasons. The third thing we learn from this is that we are powerless to overcome these seasons. Now, you might find yourself in a difficult season and realize that you're stuck there. No matter what you do, you can't change it. You've tried everything. Everything that you can think of to get out of this difficult season, you have tried and come up short, and you're still there. You might find yourself in a good season and suddenly realize, oh my, this is fleeting. This could end at any moment. And then you spend your whole life trying to hold on to it and trying to corral it and trying to keep it and miss out on what's happening in the midst of it. And because change is inevitable, it means that we really are powerless to overcome the times and seasons in our lives. We must therefore learn to navigate these seasons and accept them, knowing that we are powerless to change them, yet we are empowered to affect how we respond, and we're hoping in the God who determines these times and seasons. We're hoping in the God that's at work in the bad times and the good times. We're hoping in the God that ordained these times and seasons to point us to the fact that our hope isn't here. There's one final thing we need to see from this poem, and that is that no season lasts forever. So this is really good news or really bad news, depending on where you're at right now, right? If you're in a really crummy season, this is great news because it's not going to last forever. You'll come out of it. The season will change. The time for you to walk through that difficulty will pass. If you're in a really good season, guess what? The same truth. It won't last forever. The season that you're in now will end and another will take its place. You will find the season of joy as a memory. And you're now in a season of sorrow, or you will find the season of sorrow as a memory, and you're now in a season of joy. It doesn't last forever, even though in the midst of it, it can seem like it's lasting forever. So this calls us to have a different perspective on life, right? This calls us to look beyond the circumstance that we're in right now and recognize there's a time to be born and a time to die. There's a time for sorrow. There's a time for joy. There's a time to laugh. There's a time to weep. And maybe I'm in a time of weeping right now, but that time of weeping will end and I will have a time to laugh. The season will change. As surely as it moves from spring to summer to fall to winter. Think of these seasons as appointed by God, your loving Father, for his glory and your good, instead of thinking of them as if I'm stuck here. Maybe that's a better way to think about it. I know a lot of people who are in a season of singleness, and they think that it's a condition, not a context. They're constantly trying to move out of it. Well, that season won't last forever. Season of raising littles won't last forever. The season of waking up at 2 a.m. to feed your kids or to calm a bad dream, that won't last forever. Seasons change. None of them last forever. So the author then, in verse 9 through 15, goes on to reflect on this poem and give an exposition of this poem. And this is the part that the birds leave out. He says this, "What gain has a worker from his toil? I have seen the business that God has given to the children of man to be busy with. He has made everything beautiful in its time. He also has put eternity into man's heart, yet so that he cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. I perceive that there is nothing better for them than to be joyful and do good as long as they live, that everyone should eat, drink, and take pleasure in his toil. This is God's gift to man. I perceive that whatever God does endures forever. Nothing can be added to it, nor taken away from, nor anything taken from it. God has done it so that people fear before him. That which is already has been. That which is to be already has been. God seeks what has been driven away." So in verse 9, there's this question, this rhetorical question. If we're the center of reality, what gain is there? And the answer is not much, as we've seen through the first 2 chapters. And we can hope in those things, right? We can sit there and hope in our education. We can hope in our business that we've built. We can hope in our marriage. And if that's the case, just go back and read chapter 2. It's not something to build your life on. Wisdom, money, success, drink, knowledge, pleasure. He concludes that it's all have all. And so he becomes frustrated because he realized that all of those things are fleeting. And in the process of pursuing all of these things, he was putting himself at the center. So if you've sat in any time that Ron Selak has taught anything at Arbor Drive, he always has. It's going to be trademarked, right? It's the Ron Selak graphic, and it's a big circle, and then there's a little me in the center of it, right? And this is everything funnels down to me. I'm at the center of the universe. I'm at the center of everything. And that's the way to live and end up with everything being heval, everything being vanity, everything being meaningless. And it's not that those achievements are bad. In fact, that he concludes in the end of the last chapter that we should enjoy them. They just don't endure. They don't last. Now, in this text, though, he's not the center. God is. He makes a shift. He moves from himself being the center in pursuit of his wisdom, his knowledge, his pleasure, his work being the center and trying to find meaning and purpose and fulfillment, to God being at the center. So take Ron Selak's TM image and replace me with God. And that's what he's talking about here. God, in this text, is the one who's taking action. He makes everything beautiful in its time. He is the one who sets eternity in our hearts. He is the one who works, and therefore, he is at the center. And as a result of this, when we change our perspective, orient our faith toward God in that way, guess what happens with a time to be born and a time to die, a time to weep, a time to laugh, a time to rejoice, all of those. We're actually able to live in that. we're actually able to endure that. We're able to walk through that in a totally different way. We can live in seasons. We can enjoy gifts. We can weather change. And all of that is done because the world is not ultimate. He is ultimate. God is ultimate. We have an eternal perspective. So verse 11, it says that in the last half of that verse, he says, he has put eternity into man's heart. What does that mean? It means that we recognize our outer being, that all of the things of, we recognize that in our inner being, that all of the things of life are not lasting. We all know that. That's not anything new. The poem has already explained that. It's already highlighted that. And by setting eternity in man's heart, the author is saying that this poem makes sense because God made you to see that. He made you to recognize that you are an eternal being living in a temporal world. He made you as an eternal soul living in a world where everything is fading and one day everything will burn up, where nothing lasts, where there's constant change, where things don't go the right way. A house fire can burn up all the things that we built our lives around. We could get fired and thrown into financial distress. We know that we lose loved ones. All of the joys and pleasure in this life are accompanied by sorrows and disappointments, and they flow in seasons. And all of that is meant to point us to something greater. All of that is God setting eternity in our hearts so that we would not be satisfied in this world, but would look beyond this world for our satisfaction, look beyond this world for our identity, and look beyond this world for our hope. Because it's all transient. It's all fading. It's all changing. It's not something to build our lives on. And so God putting eternity in our heart means that we are actually longing for something that lasts, something that's permanent, something that truly satisfies us, which is why all of the things in this life that we tend to hope in and build ourselves or build our lives around always let us down, which is why in chapter 2, he concludes that everything is haval, which is why his pursuit of identity and purpose and meaning and value through knowledge and wisdom and pleasure and work came up short, because God has put eternity in our hearts. C.S. Lewis perhaps had this text in mind when he said, if I find in myself desires which nothing in this world can satisfy, the only logical explanation is I was made for another world. And we know this is true because God made us for himself. So Augustine said this, our hearts are restless until they find rest in thee. A restless heart that's trying to find rest in this world is a testimony to the fact that God has put eternity in your heart, meaning that nothing in this world will satisfy you. And the aim of that is not to discourage you. Well, maybe it is. No. The aim of that is to discourage you. It's to discourage you from pursuing these things in the world. And it's to encourage you toward pursuing God. All of the seasons change. Life changes quickly. And so what that is telling us is we need to live in seasons, but build our lives around someone who doesn't change, because this world is not our home and our hope is not here. So James 1:17 says that with God there is no change. Every good and perfect gift comes down from the Father of lights, in whom there is no change. We need to build our lives around something permanent. So if we live with temporal things at the center, we'll end up like the dwarves in the last battle, who insist that Aslan's country was a dirty stable and violets were stable litter. And the point of God setting eternity in our hearts is to live as we were created, as never being fully satisfied with less than what we were created for. And that actually enables us to enjoy and be satisfied in the gifts that God gives because they're aimed at pointing us to Him as the giver. There's something in us, though, even with those good gifts, that longs for more. Something was put in us by God to point us to Him as the fountain of true satisfaction of joy, the spring of living water that truly satisfied. So to be content with seasons and learn to live in them means that we're finding solid, unchanging footing through faith in Christ. And while we long for eternity, we can be content now in God. There's another thing that he says here in verse 11. He has made everything beautiful in its time. Rest and be content in the reality of the fact that we are not in control, but cared for and loved by the one who is in control and who is working for us. We can rest in our trust in God because He is making things beautiful in their time. He is at work. He is the one who does it. So remember I said God overcomes sin? He's making things beautiful. He's creating a new humanity. He's bringing people out of darkness into His marvelous light. The shadowy beauty of this world is fading and will give way to eternal beauty when Christ returns. All things will be made new. When sin is eradicated from earth, when it's remade, when we have new bodies that inhabit it with Christ. So it's interesting because God fitted bodies for us for this creation in Genesis, right? And then sin came in and corrupted both creation and our bodies. And what we find in the new heavens and the new earth is that God is actually making a new earth to fit our bodies. Because we have new bodies that are extensions and reflections of His glory. And that's why Paul says in Romans chapter 8, all of creation is eagerly awaiting the revelation of the sons of God. It's glorious and new because He makes us that way. I will give you a new heart, a new spirit I will put within you. He is making you new if you're a Christian. He's continually in the business of renovating your heart. There's areas in your heart that are old that He's making new. There's areas in your life that He's chipping off little bits to make a new creation. And He is at work in the lives of His people, in the life of His church, in creation through His church and through His Spirit. And so God makes things beautiful in their time. And all of this is so that we would fear God. He is continuing to work by conforming you to the image of Christ. He that began a good work in you will bring it to completion in the day of our Lord Jesus. You're always going to be a work in progress. Stop thinking that that's a bad thing. You don't arrive in this world. Things change for you permanently. The things are all totally made new in their time. And that time is when Christ returns and we receive new bodies. In the meantime, accept the season that you're in and learn to glorify God through hoping in Him in that season, knowing that He is at work in small ways, continuously changing you and making you new now, though it has not yet fully been brought to completion yet. And then that day, all of the corruption will be done away with. In the meantime, as we wait for that, the teacher gives us an admonition to enjoy the gifts that God has given in verses 12 through 13. He says, I perceive that there is nothing better for them than to be joyful and do good as long as they live, and that everyone should eat and drink and take pleasure in all his toil. This is God's gift to man. So God has given us food, family, drink, laughter, yes, but He has also given us discipline and difficulty. In James chapter 1, those good and perfect gifts include counting it all joy, my brothers, when you face trials of various kinds. So that means that whatever season that you're in, There are good gifts that God has given you that you're meant to enjoy in the midst of that season. If it's a difficult season, maybe it's the gift of God taking things away and chipping away at the idols in your life and the things that you put your hope in so that you will hope in him. If it's a really good season, maybe it's the fact that God has even given us anything good at all in the midst of this broken ashes of Eden. And we can enjoy that to its fullest because God has given it. And in enjoying that, we're enjoying God. So the teacher admonishes us to live in seasons, being content with what God has given, knowing that his gifts are good, and learning to embrace those gifts and those seasons in faith, trusting that God is ultimate and satisfies his people. So I was talking with somebody last week, and they said that they did a study of Ecclesiastes a while back, and one of the things that stuck with her was the pastor said, eat Rocky Road ice cream. That sounded kind of familiar, so I did some digging, and I found that quote was from a book called A Life Well Lived by Tommy Nelson, and this is what he wrote. Everyone is going to die. As you read this book, the clock is ticking. The 24-hour virus is waiting on you. There are germs in your teeth that will cause cavities. One day you'll have a root canal. All of those things are bad and they are coming. So today, while everything is okay, go get a double dip of Rocky Road ice cream or whatever flavor you love. Take some friends or family with you. Lick your ice cream slowly and just enjoy being together. Call an old friend you haven't spoken to in a while and get caught up. Rent a movie you've waited for or you've wanted to see and curl up on the sofa with some hot popcorn. Enjoy today, love God, and enjoy life. Have fun. Listen, it's almost like evangelicals need permission to have fun. Like, should I go on vacation if I gave, that money to the church? If you're in a good season, enjoy that good season. If you're in a difficult season, learn from that season. That's what God is up to. That's what he's doing. And the point is, to enjoy the good times means to enjoy God. And I would add to what he said, embrace the bad times as equally good gifts by a loving Father that has the same aim from a different approach. Learn to endure difficulty and sorrow and hardship as seasons that will pass, and in which God is working for your good and for his glory. So there's the permission. Enjoy life. Enjoy it by enjoying God and hoping in God. There's qualifications to it. But enjoy life. We shouldn't be morose people. We shouldn't be curmudgeon-y people. We should be people that find joy in the different seasons that God has had us in, or he has us in, because we see good gifts all over the place. And the fact that we can have joyful homes in the midst of a broken world is a testimony to God's grace. The fact that illness is not permanent is a witness to his mercy. He will provide, he will overcome, he will satisfy us. The last thing that we see here in verse 14, I perceive that whatever God does endures forever. Nothing can be added to it, nor anything taken from it. God has done it so that the people fear before him. The transcendence of this world, or the transience of this world, I get those two words mixed up. The transience of this world is overcome by the permanence of God. His work endures. It's the quality that we're looking for. And if we rest in God's work, we will endure because he is at work in us, both to will and to work for his good pleasure. He is in control. He oversees creation. He raises up nations and tears them down. He directs the heart of the king like a river. He gives you the new birth. He ordained your salvation. He declares his people have been justified and adopted. He oversees the seasons of your life. And what he does never fails and can't be changed. So slow down and learn to find contentment in him. Embrace and endure the varying seasons of life in the ashes of Eden while hoping in this sovereign God. Let's pray.